Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Initiative for Bicycle and Pedestrian Innovation webinar, Pedestrians Count, How to Measure Foot Traffic. I'm Hal Hagedorn, and I will be your moderator for today. I'm the Associate Director for the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University, also known as TREC, which houses the Initiative for Bicycle and Pedestrian Innovation, also known as IBPI. We are hosting a special webinar today in support of the Non-Motorized Traffic Monitoring, Pedestrian Monitoring Techniques and Procedures project. So this project is being conducted by Portland State University, ICF International, and Sprinkle Consulting for the Federal Highway Administration. The goal of this project is to develop and recommend technical procedures for capturing pedestrian traffic volumes under short duration and permanent count scenarios to inform future editions of FHWA's Traffic Monitoring Guide. So in order to achieve this goal, the project team wants to hear directly from everyone who is involved in pedestrian counting about the programs that you may have in your communities. The team is using this webinar to collect this information in real time, and we will be asking for information from you throughout the webinar on your knowledge and experience with these types of technologies and count programs. I will touch more on this. I will touch more on how to do this later in my brief overview of the of the webinar. So this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the video and slides will be included in a post-webinar email. So the webinar also has been approved for 1 hour of professional development credit. Our speakers for today will be covering multiple aspects of pedestrian traffic monitoring using content from Chapter 4 of the Federal Highway Administration's Traffic Monitoring Guide, titled Traffic Monitoring for Non-Motorized Traffic, and their own experience as well. So you'll hear from our experts on this. So today we have with us the FHWA Program Manager, David Jones, who will give a brief overview and context for the project. We also have Shawn Turner with the Texas Transportation Institute, who is the primary author of Chapter 4 in the TMG, and he will give an introduction to pedestrian counting in general, including count locations and technologies. We have Theo Petritsch of Sprinkle Consulting, who will describe how seasonal adjustment factors can be used to estimate annual average daily pedestrian traffic on short duration counts. Krista Nordback with Portland State University is here as well, and she will discuss the pedestrian count data management and sharing. And then last but not least, we have Scott Brady, who is the manager of travel monitoring at the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission in the Philadelphia area, and he will share his experience in building an extensive pedestrian monitoring program. And at the end, we do have time for a question and answer session. As I mentioned before, the format of today's webinar is different from other webinars that we have hosted in the past. Well, you will be hearing from the experts in pedestrian traffic monitoring. We know that many of you tuning in have a lot of knowledge to share on this topic. And so to help us learn from each other after each speaker presents their material, we will be asking you to share your experience about the topic presented. And how will we do that? So after each short presentation, a question or prompt will be given to you, and we will ask you to enter your response into an online shared Google spreadsheet. The URL to this spreadsheet is bit.ly/PEDSCount. You can go to this link on your own browser, input your response, and you can see in real time what others have shared. You can access the different questions by clicking the tabs at the bottom of the spreadsheet. And again, we will cover each question after each speaker has presented. So this document will also be available after the webinar if you choose to share later, or if you want to read what others have written. And if you cannot access this Google document, you can write your responses in the chat pad, and we do have folks that will add those responses to the Google spreadsheet. So the information that you share will help inform our findings and recommendations for pedestrian travel monitoring practices for future versions of the traffic monitoring guide. So it is really important that we get this information from you. And we will try to highlight some of the responses during the webinar so that we can all learn from each other. And then just after all of our speakers have presented, we will use the remaining time to answer any questions you may have. And you can ask those questions by typing your questions into your questions pane of your control panel. And I will be collecting those questions and moderating the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So before we begin and I hand things over to our experts, we do want to know a little bit about who's joining us today. So including yourself, how many participants are at your site viewing the webinar? Select just me if you're viewing the webinar by yourself. We also have options for 2 to 5, 6 to 10, or more than 10 people. You should be able to see the poll and select your answers, select your response on your screen. So just take a moment to select a choice. And we'll close the poll once most folks have answered the question. All right, so it looks like 75% of you have voted. Okay, so this is of the 83% of you that have voted, 77% of you are tuning in just by yourself. 20% have 2 to 5 folks in their location. 2% have 6 to 10. Okay, now we have one more question for you. Are you familiar with the traffic monitoring guide? So please answer by selecting yes or no. Okay, 77% have voted. Give you a couple more seconds. And this is great. So it looks like 33% of you are familiar with the traffic monitoring guide, but 67% of you are not. So this is a great opportunity for us to share with you some of the important pieces of the TMG. And so with that, I will now hand it over to David Jones to get us started.
Great, wonderful, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and have this opportunity, and I just want to thank IFC, Portland State University, and Sprinkle for coordinating this information exchange forum to show you how we progressed on this non-motorized traffic monitoring, pedestrian monitoring techniques and procedures research. However, before I get started, I just want to give you a little information on the Highway Policy Information Office, the sponsor of this work, and what we do. We establish data collection policies and guidelines. We facilitate the application of technology. We collect and analyze highway-related data. We provide technical assistance of all sorts. We provide training. We also involved in motor fuel use, highway financing, driver's license. We collect that information. We collect vehicle registration information. We also have the National Household Travel Survey, of course, and then the Highway Performance Monitoring Systems data set. We keep that. We also collect vehicle volume, vehicle classification, and vehicle wind and motion data. We also published the biannual conditions and performance report that goes to Congress every 2 years. And of course, many of you may know about the annual highway statistics publications that comes out every year, and of course the traffic monitoring guide, which this research is targeted on. So the bottom line here is our office, we develop and provide traffic monitoring guidance to all traffic monitoring practitioners. And the 2013 Traffic Monitoring Guide, as mentioned in Chapter 4, titled Traffic Monitoring for Non-Motorized Traffic, offers basic techniques for both pedestrian and bicycle monitoring. However, while in principle these basic techniques do cover the issue, it still lacks the comprehensiveness needed to cover all pedestrian travel scenarios. So the goal of this research project is to develop a more specific procedures for pedestrian traffic covering different scenarios such as sidewalks, crosswalks, shared pedestrian/bike paths, stairways in conjunction with elevators and ramps, overpasses and underpasses. So the outcome of this research is to develop and provide detailed procedures to capture pedestrian traffic under a wide range of scenarios, both short duration and long-term coverage. So we have a lot of information to cover. That's just to highlight, you know, what this work is all about. So I'm going to turn it back over to Hal. And thank you.
Great, thank you, David. Now we will hear from Shawn Turner on the pedestrian travel monitoring count, locations, and technology. Go ahead, Shawn.
Thank you, Hal, and hi, everyone. This is Shawn. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So counts of people who are walking are important for a number of reasons. Many of the reasons listed here are transportation related because that's probably what most of us do for a living. But one of the things that I've noticed in the past few years is that there's other groups who are interested in counting people who are walking. These might include economic development, retail, tourism, maybe events management, and so forth. And maybe some of the folks on the webinar today fall into those categories. I think this is a very good thing for us transportation and travel monitoring folks. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later in my slides. For each reason why counting pedestrians is a good idea, there are an equal number of challenges, and I'm showing some of those here. In general, pedestrians are less confined to fixed lanes or paths than cars and trucks, and they can sometimes make unpredictable movements, like standing smack dab in the middle of your counting sensor. There's also several challenges that are equipment related, and I expect we'll hear about a fair number of those later. These are expected given the relative newness of some of the automated pedestrian counting. We should realize, though, that some of the automated counting equipment for cars and trucks is also still being refined, and some of these car and truck counting technologies will always have certain limitations. So I think we need to put it in context. We can't expect perfect accuracy overnight for pedestrian counting equipment. At this point, we just simply need to understand the limitations and work at refining and improving the equipment that is made available. Along with the technical challenges that I'm showing on the left-hand side, there's also institutional challenges. Some agencies are hard-pressed to do more data collection with the same or fewer resources. And sometimes it's a challenge to do that data collection with staff who are unfamiliar with pedestrian counting. It uses different equipment than car and truck counting, and it's typically focused on different roads and maybe different areas than car counting. I think this is time for our first question.
Thank you, Shawn. So for those, yes, that is. So I just wanted to mention, for those who may have tuned in a little bit later and may have not caught the introduction, so this webinar is a little bit different in that we are trying to gather information from the audience as well as present information from our experts. So after each presenter presents, we do have a brief question or question that we will probe the audience for answers for. And so the first question we have that relates to what Shawn just presented is, what problems have you encountered in trying to count pedestrians? So we do have some folks who have responded to that question, but if you have a response to this, you can go to the link that we have up there, http://bit.ly/pedscount to enter in your response. And so I'll just read a couple of the issues that some of the folks have entered into this spreadsheet. So Kristen says that an additional difficulty she's run into in counting pedestrians is finding funds to buy technologies to count pedestrians more efficiently, as well as attracting interest in pedestrian monitoring from management, not just for traffic or safety purposes, but also for real estate and development needs. So we've also heard from Christian reporting difficulty choosing corridors to count and adjust to new counting equipment. Benjamin from the Regional Planning Commission in Wisconsin reports success with video and infrared counting, as well as the sheer size of the urbanized region is a struggle with only 6 counters, and I can imagine that being pretty challenging. And then another issue that I'd like to point out is in New York City, they're reporting the challenges with manual counts of pedestrians in high volume locations, so where hourly volumes can exceed 6,000 pedestrians per hour. So Shawn, do you have any reactions to those comments?
Yeah, and I think that those are all those are valid challenges. I think we're going to have those. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you might overcome them. The one thing that I wanted to point out that Krista mentioned is, and I'm going to mention this as well a little bit later, is that there's a number of folks besides just traffic and transportation that could be and may be interested in counting people walking in your particular city. I know in several instances the transportation agencies have been able to essentially get funding grants from public health organizations and have been able to essentially partner with public health to get these counts. So that's something that I would certainly encourage, especially when you're dealing with large urban areas and you're sort of trying to deal with an overwhelming number of sites, is look around in your city, in your region, and see who else might also be interested in the same thing or a very similar thing as what you are.
And that's great. And thank you to all of those who have shared your experiences. I also noticed that there are some folks that can't or are having difficulties editing the Google document. And if you're having issues editing it and want to comment, you can also chat us with your comment, and we will capture those and add that to the document. And so now let's learn a little bit more about, from Shawn about the pedestrian count location types and equipment. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Shawn.
Okay, thank you, Hal. So next I'm going to talk about the counting locations, mostly to highlight that there's a much wider variety of location types with pedestrian counting than with traditional car and truck traffic monitoring. But one of the implications that I also want to mention is that with this wide variety of counting locations, you may need to use different types of equipment at these different locations. Or in some cases, the locations may be so challenging that some of the automated equipment you may just have to simplify to something like video recording the scene to have humans count manually after the fact. So let me just run through a couple of slides. So the traditional location for monitoring traffic, either cars, trucks, or pedestrians, it's a mid-block, mid-interchange, one that's away from all the turning movements of an intersection or interchange. These locations really simplify equipment installation. You can typically get pretty accurate counts. And I would imagine that the folks in the audience looking at this, y'all would probably love to have all of your counting sites that are as simple as this, right? Well, one of the issues that sites that are easiest to count may not be where most people are walking, as you might infer from this vacant sidewalk in this photo. One of the other very common locations for counting pedestrians and cyclists for that matter is on shared use paths. Overall, it's still a pretty easy location for equipment installation and optimizing accuracy, particularly if you select a path location where people tend to keep moving, and that's away from areas where maybe people congregate or where people may have a chance to divert off the main path. In this particular slide, you'll see some newly installed inductance loops for bicyclists. That's right behind the heels of those runners. And then over to the right-hand side, it's a little bit out of the view of the picture, it's a post-based infrared sensor. And so the inductance loops count the bikes, the infrared sensor from the side counts the total. You subtract the bikes from the total, and there you have pedestrians. And in this particular system, you can get the counts on both you can get both bike and pedestrian counts on a directional basis. So that's easy, right? Well, let's look at a few more challenging locations. So intersections and crosswalks, that's another key area for counting pedestrians. But as you can see, even in this pretty simple picture at this mid-block crosswalk, there's a bit more complexity. Some people are walking along the sidewalk without crossing. There's some people that are crossing. And there's a few people that are simply there. They're either standing or pacing, or maybe they're waiting for a bus or a friend or something like that. Or maybe they're even standing in the sensor zone. Maybe they're blocking the sensor, or maybe they're repeatedly activating the sensor. So you can see how in these different location types, these different situations, we may need to select different types of equipment or how we are positioning and installing the same piece of equipment. At some locations, we may need to think in 3 dimensions, and that is stairways, overpasses, underpasses. In some cases, these may be short connecting routes for pedestrians, but they can be just as important. And in some cases, these locations might actually simplify the counting task because it essentially forces pedestrians in a somewhat fixed and limited pathway. It's definitely not a traditional place where we count cars and trucks. Here's where things really get interesting. This isn't quite Times Square, but it's a crowded sidewalk, and it includes both moving and stationary pedestrians. And so think about how we're going to count this. I should repeat what I said earlier, that the easiest sites to count may not be the ones we should focus on. That is where most pedestrian activity is occurring. And I'm going to mention a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. So let's get beyond sidewalks, and let's talk about, for example, pedestrian malls and maybe pedestrian-only streets, or maybe it's only a pedestrian-only street for just part of the day. The other day it's open for motor vehicle use. Even more challenging. So these areas are usually fairly wide, usually crowded, a mix of people moving, not moving, and in some cases, people are passing the same point multiple times. You know, just sort of looking at this scene and kind of makes my head hurt about how I would, quote, count, unquote, the pedestrians along this street. But as I mentioned earlier, there are other groups of folks that care about the numbers of people that are walking. And so, for example, I could almost guarantee you that all the store owners along this pedestrian mall care about how many people are walking past their storefront. And by the same token, they may even be more interested in how many people might be stopping in front of their storefront but not coming in. Smart retailers are increasingly looking at flows of people to improve and optimize store layout and displays, and I think that's one of the groups that potentially could be an ally, could be a partner in our quest to count accurately numbers of people that are walking. Okay, so what does all this mean? Where should you get started in your city? I think the first thing that you should think about and discuss with your stakeholders is this. How do you plan to use the counts? Because the uses are really going to guide a lot of your decisions about location. For example, do you want overall citywide trends? If you do, then you might pick several representative indicator locations. You don't have to count everywhere, you just want an indicator. And these don't necessarily have to be the sites with the highest pedestrian traffic. It can just be representative indicator sites. Or maybe you want to capture the impacts of specific sidewalk or path improvements. Or maybe you want to capture the impact of special events. And so in these particular cases, you want to focus on specific locations or times, but don't forget to add in a few control locations or times that's going to give you a baseline and really a better indicator of how these changes have happened over time. And so on. Again, really focusing not just on jumping out there and getting started with counting, but how are you planning to use the data? That's going to guide a lot of your decisions. In reality, your counts are probably going to be used for multiple purposes, and so any monitoring program is likely to contain a mix of sites that are going to serve different purposes. One of the most important things about location is this. You should plan to have one or more permanent locations that provide year-round data, and permanent is almost going to mean that it's got to be automated. Permanent locations provide continuous data that are useful for several reasons, but I'm going to let Theo explain that a little bit later in our webinar. Okay, so with that, I'm going to transition into the counting technologies. I'm not going to get into too many details on the counting technologies. Instead, I'm going to refer you to two other documents that are much more thorough than I can be in the next 5 or so minutes. The first, as you've heard, is the traffic monitoring guide. The flow chart that I have here on this slide is actually from the traffic monitoring guide, and it was designed to help connect people with the best technologies for their applications. You might see that there are two very important factors that we've numbered on this flow chart. And those two factors are, number one, what are you counting, or who are you counting? Are you counting bikes only, pedestrians? Are you willing to get a combined bike and pedestrian total, or do you want to count pedestrians and cyclists separately? So that's your number one, is what are you counting? And then second most important is how long are you counting? And that really determines sort of how portable your equipment should be. There's several other factors beyond just these two that I've mentioned. Some of them are included in the flow chart, things like cost. Other things you're going to want to consider: accuracy, ease of installation and use. Also, I mean, this is a very common thing, is people want to know, well, what's everyone else using? Because sometimes that can be an indicator of what's working well. And so in this particular chart, we're showing common practices that are they're indicated with a filled circle. So this is a I would put this as a cliff notes for the different kinds of technology. The second piece of guidance that I want to mention is the one at the bottom, and this is really, I think this NCHRP report is really the encyclopedia of everything that we know at this point about counting equipment. This is NCHRP report 797, and it has an accompanying web-only document. There's a ton of information in this NCHRP report if you're willing to dive into those details and really figure out the pros and cons of the different types of technology. So last slide, but as a researcher and a technology geek, I also wanted to mention sort of what's on the horizon beyond what everyone is using now. You know, we talk about the challenges. Sometimes we may not look ahead and see the potential that's just a year or two or so out. So I wanted to just mention quickly a few things. You know, having been in the traffic monitoring area for 20 or so years, I'm seeing a lot more automated video image processing, and in particular, big companies like with an international market, companies like TrafficCon, who they just renamed to FLIR, but also companies that are essentially coming more or less from outside the traffic realm. Startup companies like MotionLoft and PlaceMeter, they're really filling a demand for people counts that's coming from these non-traffic groups in retail and tourism. One of the other things that I'm seeing a lot of is mobile device identification. I think I've seen that mentioned already in one of the shared documents. And I've definitely seen it in practice, people using Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and maybe even some of the newer technologies, low-powered location beacons like iBeacon. Certainly it gives you a sample of people, but it can give you useful information nonetheless. The final thing I wanted to mention is the whole wearable fitness and health and technology. There's all sorts of things happening in this, from smartwatches and fitness trackers. I don't know if anyone has heard of smart clothing. There's a company that I heard about recently called Hexoskin. Sensors are getting smaller and smaller, and they're becoming more integrated into people's daily lifestyle, recognizing that it's only going to be a sample of everybody, but in some cases that sample can tell us some useful information. And so I view all of these, even despite the challenges that we've talked about, I view all these as very positive developments. It means that lots of people are interested in getting data about people on foot, and lots of people outside of transportation traffic. So with lots of people spending money, there's competition among these companies who've got to innovate and improve their products if they want to stay in business. And I think some of these improved products are going to trickle down and be used by us traffic geeks. And in other cases, some of the data that may be collected by other industries, there may be pedestrian counts that are collected by retail or tourism, that might also start flowing our way, or we might work towards partnerships with these other groups. So only time will tell, but at this point, I'm pretty optimistic. So with that, I'll turn it back to Hal.
Great. Okay, great. Thanks, Shawn. Thanks for talking about some of the key challenges as well as counting locations and counting technologies. So we're going to throw it back to the audience, and we're going to we want to hear from you, and we want your input. So please tell us about your pedestrian counting practices, including technologies and locations. So you can share that information by either going to the Google spreadsheet, and I know that some folks have been having issues with accessing that URL, but that spreadsheet is here. Click on the Q2 tab on the bottom, and you can enter in your responses. This is the first time we've ever done this, and we have about 300 people in the audience, and so we are going to experience some technical issues. If you cannot access that Google spreadsheet, you can also enter in your response in the questions, and we do know who is asking those questions, so you don't have to indicate your affiliation or who you are. You can just type in your response to the tell us about your pedestrian counting practices, including technologies and locations. So I'm going to give folks a few minutes to enter in their responses, and I will also share some of the responses that we've received so far. So here are a couple of them. So the City of Milwaukee reports using manual intersection counts and infrared counters on trails. So Shawn, is that something that's common?
Yes, yeah, and in some cases, I think what some folks are doing is they're essentially trying to multitask. So, for example, if you're doing intersection turning counts for vehicles, why not count pedestrians at the same time? Same thing with, I know in this case it's with car and bike traffic, but essentially when the City of Houston, for example, is trying to count cars on streets, and someone's out there with a portable counter, simply lay out a bike counter as well.
Okay, so what about automated counting technology for crosswalks using stereo camera and laser scanners? Have you heard of that?
Yes, I have, and I've heard of the MIGMA system. I think we may have done a little bit of testing with that. That's certainly one of the technologies that's available.
Okay, okay. And then it seems like Wisconsin and Morgantown, they're using infrared counters and combining those with the inductive loops or tube counters to separate bicycle from pedestrian counts. And then New York City reports using, is it the MioVision, the video data collection system, and place meter using smartphone sensors as well as manual counts.
Yes, and just so one comment, I think you're seeing this in folks' remarks, is that there's not one single best solution. I think you need to find what works best for you, given what your needs are and given, honestly, what the limitations of all these different technologies are.
Great, that's great. So now let's learn about count durations and seasonal adjustment factors. And so we have Theo Petritsch from Sprinkle Consulting, who will share with us his experiences on this.
Thank you very much. I've sort of been poking ahead to the other questions and noticing that some people are saying that they have longer term counts, 12-hour counts, and 3 times a day counts and things like that, and that's reassuring. And the reason for that is if you look in the TMG, it recommends if you're going to do automated counts, do 7-day counts and up to 14-day counts. With respect to counting, lots is good, more is better, too much is just about right. You want to maximize the amount of counting you can do because, as you're going to see at sort of a group exercise here in just a second, it makes a huge difference if you have good adjustment factors. One of the things I want to reiterate what Shawn said, there's numerous communities that when they're doing portable counts with tubes. They will go out and put in a tube across the bike lane or the outside of the travel lane or the adjacent shared use path. So when they're doing the motor vehicle counts, they're also getting bicycle counts. Pedestrian counts are a little bit harder, but there are some locations that are going to be experimenting with, when they go out and do their standard counts for the roadway, collecting bicycle and pedestrian data at the same time. The challenge with that, as Shawn said, is finding a good place for your counter and making sure that you're counting what you think you're counting. But again, what we're going to talk about over the next few minutes is the manual counts. As you can see, the minimum of 4 hours is recommended. I understand full well that there is currently a practice of 2 hours in many places. I also understand that resources being what they are, and that 2 hours is often the best you can do. But as you're going to see in a minute, 4 hours can lead to some interesting data anomalies if you're not careful, and 2 hours even more so. And so while I understand many people are doing 2 hour counts, with TMG, and I recommend 4 hour counts, 12 hours if you can do it. For manual counts, that's probably going to mean video. Automated counts, 7 days up to 14 days. And the reason for that is factoring. If you have highly consistent traffic, and if your traffic is, it's commuter route, it's the same day to day, it's out in front of, it's a downtown, that by and large the volumes are the same every day. Short duration counts may make sense. They may be able to be used, but you'd still need some long-term counts to confirm that your traffic out there is as consistent as you think it is. So once you nail down that it's consistent, the shorter duration counts can be used. Another thing that has to be taken into account with the shorter term counts is, what is the day like on the day you're out there? If you go out and do short term counts on a day it's raining, and we know we wouldn't want to do that, but even a light sprinkle, you might be tempted to do your counts because you've got a bunch of counts to do and you just need to get them done. That's going to affect how many people are in the field. That seems fairly obvious, but it's something that, again, in this day of limited resources, which I think is every day, it's an issue. If it's foggy, if it's too hot, if it's too cold, all these things are going to impact whether or not the counts are going to give you a truly typical view of the pedestrians that are using your facility. So again, the longer you can do counts, or the more counts you can do to make sure that you know what's going on a typical day, if you will, the better. All of those things noted above, the temperatures, the weather, and those sorts of things, go into what's called factoring. And what you do when you do a roadway count is, what we've been doing for years is you count some sections of roadway continuously. All the time they're being counted. And then you go and you say, well, we're going to count these other locations every once in a while, or we're going to use our permanent locations to calibrate our short-term locations. Well, that works fine if you know what type of facility you're using. So a downtown sidewalk, you can imagine, isn't going to have the same traffic patterns as a sidewalk next to a park in a rural area, or a sidewalk on an approach to school. So you need to know what types of roadways you're monitoring and what types of side facilities are adjacent to those roadways, so that when you are using your long-term counts to calibrate, if you will, your short-term counts, or extrapolate your short-term counts, you are in fact comparing like facilities and like locations. You also need to consider what types of traffic patterns you're monitoring. Again, if you're on an area that is obviously served for people walking from an apartment complex to a employment center, maybe you've got specific commuter type patterns you're monitoring. If it's by a school, obviously you've got school patterns, but some areas, and most areas are in fact, they're a mix of recreational commuter, school commuter type facilities. So you really need to be aware of what types of facilities you're monitoring and what the traffic patterns are. And to give an example of the difference that makes, and really to underscore the need for longer term counts, we're going to talk about factoring and how you apply those to shorter term counts. So if you think about what sort of counts you may need, or factors you may need, I just jumped ahead on a slide. I talked about something here that I talked about: commuter, recreational, utility, mixed trip purposes. I already talked about that, but it's because my slides are out of order on my paper. But there it is. There's several different types, and this mixed purposes is huge. There's going to be huge variation in these mixed purposes. When you look at the classification of counts, there's a couple of things you look at typically. You look at the month, the day of the week. As you can imagine, weekday counts are variable. Do you have many people on weekends? Do you have people during the day? This count over here was in fact taken, these are actual counts, they're from a trail, but they were actually taken on a facility. They're real counts, and they happen to be of all non-motorized transportation users, but we're going to use them for illustrative purposes. This is a high commuter trip location slide, and you can kind of see that throughout the year, you've got pretty constant travel. You know, in the cold, this happens to be in Colorado, so in your colder months it dips down. In your nicer months it comes up, and then as it gets colder it dips down again. But it's relatively constant throughout the year. This red line is your weekday average. This blue line is your combined average of weekday and weekends, and this green line is your weekend average. So again, since it's a commuter route, you can see there's a lot fewer people walking on weekends than there are on weekdays. Contrast that to a high recreational trip location. Again, let's start at the back. This is your weekend average. Obviously, there's a lot more people out there recreating on the weekend than on the weekdays. And again, given that this is Colorado, you've got a significant more pedestrians and non-motorized users out there during the warmer months than you do during the winter months. Perhaps if we had been counting cross-country skiers, we would have gotten a different result. But this is for bicyclists and pedestrians, this particular chart. So if I say, well, my average volume is this number right here, but I did my count in the middle of June, you can see that I might conceivably be underestimating my entire annual volume, and we'll get more into that in a second. If you look at the day of week, this is Sunday, this is Saturday, and this is the weekdays, this kind of makes sense for a high commute trip. This is what happens to be broken out by month of year. Again, bear in mind this is Colorado. So between June and September, we have more users than we have during October to May, but the pattern is the same. Lots of people commuting during the week, fewer on weekends. I hope that makes sense. On a high recreational trip location, we have an inverse pattern. We have where we have much more use on the weekends than we have on the weekdays. We do this type of pattern, we determine this type of pattern for motorists all the time. There are parts of all of your DOTs that are dedicated to determining what these patterns are for motorists on various types of roadways. Interstates, rural highways, urban collectors, they're dedicated to doing this, and you're going to see why that's important. Then you can look at the time of day. These plots are actually broken out by month of year and time of day, if you will. But if you look at a weekend in October for a commute route, well, it kind of picks up later in the afternoon. You kind of have a lunch to dinner time commute, and it drops off. Your weekday is just like for cars and everybody else. You've got a peak in the morning, a peak in the afternoon, and then it drops off. Recreational users, on the other hand, pick up later in the morning, and then they climb throughout the day, and then they drop off in the evening. Again, I hope these patterns make sense to you. These are very clearly distinguished high commute trip locations, high recreational trip locations. Most locations are going to be some sort of a mix. So based upon the slides we just saw, you're going to have adjustment factors for what month did you take your counts. What day of the week did you take your counts? And that may in fact vary by month. As we saw, you may have one type of volume when it's cold, one type of volume when it's warm. And what hour of day did you take your counts? Finally, there's the occlusion factor. If you're not familiar with occlusion, it's mostly going to show up, it's going to show up with automated counters. What that is if you use an automated counter, you may count one blob going past your counter. That's really 3 pedestrians. Occlusion is basically counting groups as an individual. So if you put up an automated counter, one thing you may have to do is, much like for motorists, we do occupancy studies for cars. We say, yes, one car went by, but on average there's 1.26 people per car. So you have to make that adjustment. You don't actually adjust your counter. This is an adjustment that is made after you get your data. You could adjust your data to represent the average group size. So that undercounting by automated counters is fairly well documented. I think it's getting better, but that's the occlusion that you have to consider. And then you also have to consider the weather. If you have a day where if you have snow patterns, you can certainly say, well, on days when it's snowing, we're going to have fewer people walking, and you can, over the long term, get that data. You can determine what those are. But the occlusion and weather are something we're not going to really show in our next little exercise. We're going to focus on the stuff you can get directly from the data that comes out of your machines, the month of year, the day of week, and the hour of day. And to do that, we're going to contrast two facilities. One is a commuter facility, one is a recreational facility. And we're going to pretend we went out there and did a count between 2 and 6 p.m. Tuesday in August. We're going to use those charts I just showed you to look at our adjustment factors and apply it to these counts to see how many people we think are out there on an average day during the year. So we have what's predominantly a commuter facility. This actually goes from a parking garage over to a hospital and other employment centers. And we have what's largely a recreational facility. Not a lot of accesses. It's strictly pretty much a place where people go out and walk for recreation, exercise, enjoyment, and things like that. So we've counted 135 cars in 4 hours. And as I said, it was a July. Let me go back. Can I do this? I can go back. Yay me. It was a Tuesday in August. So when you look, and of course I've done my line in July. Sorry. But we look at where the volume is in the month we're looking at, and for some reason I have this shown in July, but we're just going to take the exercise as writ here, and we see that this line is the average traffic during the year. Our traffic during, this says July, we're going to assume it's August, our period week count is 1.3% higher, so the way you get the factors, the average annual daily traffic divided by your monthly daily traffic gets you your factor. So we're going to have to reduce the amount we count by to 77%. On our recreational volume, it's the other way. This particular period has a lower period than your average, so you actually have to increase the volume to get your average, because we would underrepresent our average traffic if we just used the counts we took on our day in, we're going to say August. If we look at Tuesday, I see what happened is my graph has slid. We have a Tuesday, if this again is our average for every day of the week, Tuesday is overrepresented with respect to the average day of the week. So we would have to reduce that to 83% to get an accurate representation of what the true average daily traffic is. This is the average daily traffic. This is what we get on Tuesdays, so we have to reduce our count to 0.83 to determine what that traffic would actually be. The opposite is true on a recreational route. This is our average. This is what we counted. If we just said our volume is our average volume, we'd be underrepresenting the number of pedestrians we have out there. So to be fair to ourselves, we have to increase that by 18%. This number right here. The hourly daily traffic on our commute path, again, this is taken directly from those charts we had earlier, on a commute trip between 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock, that represents 40% of our daily traffic. So we have to say, well, if whatever we count, that's only 40% of what we're going to see during the day. For our recreational pattern, our daily traffic, this is during a weekday in the appropriate months, is only 26.4%. So the recreational trips are more spread out during the day. The upshot of all of this is if you run the calculations, unless you properly use the proper adjustment factors, month of year, day of week, and percent hourly daily, your commute, you would just say, all right, we've got 135 people out there in 4 hours. Well, that's nice, but if you look at the commuter facility, that really translates to only about 215 a day as opposed to the recreational facility, which is 754. So your margin for error in these counts is huge if you don't know what you're counting. So that's why the long-term counts are so very important, is that you can't figure out what these factors are unless you have long-term counts. And if you don't have those long-term counts, you're probably cheating yourself in terms of the volumes of pedestrians and bicyclists you have out there. These counts are going to be type of facility specific. They're going to be regionally specific. They may even be right down to the town specific. So when you start doing your counts, you need to make sure that when you're using a comparative facility, you've obtained these factors by doing long-term counts on one facility, and you're going to use it just down the road at another facility. You need to make sure it's the same type of facility. With that, I think I turn it back over to Hal.
Great, thanks, Theo. I know that this is a lot of detailed information to present in 15 minutes, but we're hoping that this is a start and everybody will be able to get a copy of the slides afterwards. So if you have any additional questions after the webinar, you should feel free to contact any of our experts. But for now, we want to hear from you. So please describe your short duration and continuous pedestrian count programs if you have them. Again, I know that there are folks having issues with the sharing document, but you can chat us your response in the questions pane or the chat pad. We can keep track of those responses in both of those ways. So for example, the ECWRPC in Wisconsin, they use a combination of 3-day long counts and 7-day long counts for their short duration program using mobile infrared counters, and then also rely on local municipalities who have inductive loops and infrared counters for their permanent count stations, giving them data back to a decade. So you may have a program that's as extensive as that, or for example, Morgantown, West Virginia, they're reporting that they're only using infrared sensors at 3 locations on their trail system for 9 months. Another example is the city of Milwaukee. They do not have a defined pedestrian counting program or strategy at the time. So pedestrian counts are collected as a part of intersection turning movement counts, cordon counts, and trail counts. So Theo, do you have any comments to these practices that are happening across the country?
Again, I looked at them earlier, and I think it's great that there are so many people who have continuous counters out there and that are using multiple counts. And again, anything is better than nothing. But I think it's great that they are doing. There are a bunch of agencies out there doing longer term, or at least multiple times a day, term counts.
Okay. And then what additional guidance can you provide to folks regarding continuous and short duration programs within that may be included in the traffic monitoring guide?
Well, really, there's not a lot more in there. There's the stuff that everybody's going to be talking about, where you put your counters and how you install them and how you choose where to put them. But one of the things that's coming out now is there's a couple of states right now that are doing some pilot studies on doing longer term counts, basically incorporating their bicycle and pedestrian counts into their normal traffic monitoring processes. And I think if you can do that, it's going to save you a lot of time and effort. If you can just go ahead and say, when you're out there doing the turning movement counts, count the bicyclists and pedestrians. If you're out there doing 2-week counts, tubes down, put up an eco counter to get the sidewalks in a good location, which, again, as Shawn alluded to, that's a much easier said than done. If you're putting in a permanent count station on a highway, go ahead and put in a permanent count station for pedestrians nearby as well. That way we're using the hardware that's already out there, we're using the software that's already out there, and we're going to be somebody's going to be talking about data management here in a minute. So I think taking advantages of your existing programs is going to be the most bang for the buck in getting this data, and getting data you can use to create those factors, which means you have accurate data, not just data.
Okay, great. So thanks, Theo. Next up, we have Krista Nordback of Portland State University, and she will tell us more about data management and data sharing practices. Krista?
Thanks, Hal. Talk about the elements of data management. Theo has just described some of our data. We have manual counts and automated counts, and we want to be able to put that in the same place where we can use those data and then be able to access it and use it for analysis. And part of that is we want to also check that the data is accurate and be able to visualize it to use policy decisions and other decision-making processes. So I'm going to start by talking about uploading the data. So right now we have many formats. This is an example from an infrared counter, and another example would be an automated manual, which would be something that could be collected. Oops, I'm sorry, advanced too many times on me. Oh boy. We're just going to go back. So a manual count could be collected using a PDF, which would be very difficult to take all of those PDFs and then get the data, but that's something we need to do. It could also be collected on a handheld device and sent to a central server. So there are many types of formats we're dealing with. And also, as Theo mentioned, at intersections, we can do motor vehicle counts, and often pedestrian counts are included as crosswalk counts in that motor vehicle count data set. So we can use that type of data as well. So that's a lot of different formats of data, different types of data. We want to put it all in the same place, so we need a standard format. There are some standard formats out there. National Bicycle and Pedestrian Documentation Project offers one, others do too, and the Traffic Monitoring Guide offers a standard format at the end of Chapter 7 for non-motorized traffic. So we need to take all our automated manual turning movement counts and put them in some standard format so that we can upload it to a database. But we also want to make sure that that data is correct. So we need to check it. So you've just installed your automated counter, and there are two. You may have a permanent station. If you have a permanent station, you really want to make sure that you are actually counting pedestrians. So you want to compare it to ground truth that you could collect manually using the clipboard or other devices, or to a video and then count that in the office to make sure you have a good handle on what's actually going on. Compare that to the counts that the counter is telling you, and make sure that you're counting pedestrians and not motor vehicles or other things that happen to be in the vicinity. And you want to do this even at your mobile count stations. I recommend for permanent count stations you count at least 100 to 200 pedestrians for permanent count installations to make sure you understand the error and can then compute that occlusion factor that Theo just mentioned. But even for mobile counters, when you install that, at least count 10 pedestrians and make sure that the counter is correctly working at that site, because error can vary from site to site. And NCHRP 797, as Shawn mentioned, is a very good reference for this. We also want to have an automated check of this data, so we can have our computers look for, are there too many zeros, and tell us, hey, we've only received zeros from this counter for the last day. Maybe you should look at it. Maybe it was a big weather event and that explains it. But as the data come in, it was helpful to have an automated checking process. Do we see a big spike like we see here? Do we see a big spike in our data? Is that real or a counter malfunction? So an automated flag can alert the person in charge of the data to those type of problems. And we also should compare to previous counts. Briefly, I'll talk about the database where we might store this. We need to come up with a system of how we want to relate the information about the location to the information about the detector or the human being collecting the counts to the actual count data. And so you want to think about what the purpose you're going to be using it for and what information you want to include in your database. This is an example from our work at Portland State creating the BikePed portal. Now I'll talk about downloading the data and visualizing it. I'm going to use an example from Arlington, Virginia, where they have a website that is free and open to the public. You can look at their count sites. You can select your mode of travel that you'd like to understand, the direction of travel, and the day of the week you'd like to look at. If you only want to look at weekdays, you can select that. And then you can look at a graph. So here we see the This site has more of a highs on weekends pattern, which might be recreational or some other use, probably not a commute pattern. And we also have information about weather. We see that the weather on Thursday here was probably rainy, so that might explain a lower count, but doesn't explain what's going on Friday, where we have a very low count. And we see our maximum count of 950 pedestrians on that Saturday. Compare this to the bicycle count at the same location, we see a slightly different pattern, and that's why it's important to count their bicycles and pedestrians separately so that those two patterns don't confuse us and make it impossible to see the pedestrian pattern. Here's the pattern over the day of the week. Again, we're looking for a commute pattern or some other type of pattern because we don't see the peak here from 5 to 7, but rather from 7 to 8 in the evening. That probably indicates this is not a commute pattern, although it does look similar in the morning. So once we have all this data, we need to be able to use it and share it. For example, right now we have all these local agencies collecting data, and as I think one of the folks from Wisconsin mentioned, they're using the permanent counters from another jurisdiction to help them. They're only collecting short duration counts, but if they can use other people's data for the permanent stations to create the factors Theo talked about, then they're all set. So data sharing makes sense on the local level and on the state level. The states would often like to get some of the data that the local agencies are collecting, and sometimes they collect their own data, but right now there's often not enough sharing. And then on the federal level, there are not currently pedestrian counts, but they're working on that. So we want to share between agencies to make the most of these data and to preserve the data for future use, because sometimes if someone leaves and the data are forgotten, their server is, they weren't properly stored, and we want to protect the data historically as well. So one approach would be having local agencies talk to the state agencies, and the state agencies could provide storage facility for local agencies, or regional agencies, regional metropolitan areas could provide that data storage and then could talk to the federal. Another approach would be to have an outside warehouse where data could be stored and everyone could access it, and that could be accessible online, and that's a project we are working on nationally at Portland State University. And with that, I will turn it back to Hal. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Krista. And again, it's time to share your input. And so, yes, tell us about your pedestrian count data management. How do you manage and share your data? So again, if you'd like to answer, please go to the sharing document if you can access. Otherwise, you can type in your responses in your chat pad or your questions pane, and we will collect the data. And then as you're entering the information, I'll just share with you some of the responses that we've received. And again, I know that we're sharing a lot about what Morgantown, West Virginia, New York City, and Milwaukee are doing, but they were the first ones to share their responses with us. So in West Virginia, they share their counts locally, but counts are not publicly shared. And in New York City, they maintain a traffic information management system that stores traffic data, pedestrian and bicycle counts, vehicle classification and speed, and then a GIS platform is used to organize and manage the data. So it seems like a pretty robust system that they have going in the city. Milwaukee, they share their intersection turning movement counts data that includes pedestrians with the university, regional MPO, and the Parks Department. So that's a great collaboration that they have going there in Milwaukee. And then just to mention, Portland State University is creating a national bike ped archive, which will be made public soon. And currently, it includes screen line counts from 11 counties in 5 different states. So that potentially will be a really good resource for folks. So Krista, any comments on the programs that are in place and how folks are sharing the data from the responses that we've received so far?
Yeah, I'm very happy to see so many people sharing data. I think that it helps the person sharing as well, because then they don't have to deal with all the requests coming in saying, hey, can you send me this data? If you already have a website where they can reach the data, you can just send them the link and you don't have to worry about finding the data and sending it. And like I said, you can learn a lot from others about their programs. So I think sharing data makes a lot of sense, and it's good to see regions doing that. But often smaller agencies, they need help. They don't have the infrastructure to create a nice website like what we saw for Arlington, Virginia, and what Scott's going to share soon about the Philadelphia area. So not everyone has the resources. So I think that's why the work we're doing to create a national page for bicycle and pedestrian count data sharing is very important.
So I know that you are one of the experts on pedestrian count data, and I know that quality assurance and quality control checks are really important to make sure that the data that you have is of high quality. So is there any way to standardize QA, QC methods for count data?
I think we're getting to that. At this time, we haven't had enough pedestrian count data to do the rigorous analysis to standardize those processes. We were just talking to another expert in the field, Greg Lindsay, at University of Minnesota, and he was pointing out that there's different obstacles for data when you have high volumes. I think there were some folks from New York City who have extremely high pedestrian volumes, over 5,000, 6,000 pedestrians, and you're going to see different types of data quality problems, different types of errors with your equipment, different types of things to check for at those sites than you would at a rural location in Wisconsin. So I think we're learning that, and because we haven't had enough pedestrian data and continuous count data to look at the different types of problems we're seeing, we're learning a lot right now, and that's one of the reasons for this webinar, so that we can all learn from each other. And I think that the quality process will be developing in the coming years, and I look for it's an exciting area of research.
All right. Thanks, Krista. So our final presenter for today is Scott Brady from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, and he will talk about his experience implementing an extensive pedestrian monitoring program. So I will hand things over to Scott.
Very good. Can you hear me, Hal?
Yes, I can. You sound great.
We got that right. Well, good afternoon, everyone from the East Coast. I want to talk a little bit about how DVRPC, which is the MPO for Philadelphia, put together its non-motorized travel monitoring program. So I'll give you a little bit of background, the types of counts that we undertake, the equipment that we use, and the database that is used to store the results, and show you some examples of the data and of our website, which we use to communicate that data. The genesis of our program is I have found over the years, very lucky in that our travel monitoring program here at DVRPC, we have the history on the motorized side. So we have 40 years of experience on the motorized side. The processes and programs that we undertake together with other motorized programs around the country and along with the federal guidance are tried and true. We've made the mistakes. So we can, the beauty is that we can pick up a lot of those programs from the motorized side and drop them in the non-motorized world. And we actually got involved in bicycle and pedestrian data in 2009. It was in 2000, we have basically, since 1960, measured measured vehicles and transit passengers entering our central core, the center city area. And we've done that every 5 years for traffic model validation. It's one of our screen lines. Well, when we presented the 2005 results, the board of directors said, well, why aren't you counting bikes and peds? And I kind of laughed and was like, oh God, maybe I need to retire before 2010 when we do this again. But luckily, equipment was becoming available, which allowed us to automate that data collection process. And so when we collected the data for 2010, we were able to do motorized vehicles, transit passengers, bicycles, and pedestrians entering the CBD at 87 locations. At DVRPC, I like to think of our program as being a three-legged stool, 3 different types of counts, and these are inspired by the traffic monitoring guide. Much has been said today about the permanent count program. I'm not going to repeat the details of it. And then down at the bottom we have project counts, which I'll explain a little bit about. But then there's also what I haven't heard much about in our community yet is a cyclical count program. And the cyclical count program is really the backbone of the motorized side. And when I say that, basically if you're a state DOT counting traffic, you count each of your segments once every 3 years or once every 5 years for a federal aid route, etc. And this is the data that is used by FHWA for trend analysis and also to, more importantly, return the amount of federal gas tax to the individual states. And so we have a cyclical count program that we launched last year. So those are the 3 types of counts that we undertake. The permanent count program has been talked about. We basically have sites where we collect data 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, organize them into factor groups based on the travel characteristics, develop from that seasonal correction factors. Now, where we stand today is we originally envisioned 12 permanent stations on the regional trail network. All 12 of those have now been installed, and then you see 6 pending. Wait a minute, that's more than 12. Well, when we got these installed and we published the first year of data, all of a sudden a bunch of other nonprofits came forward and said, hey, what about us? If we buy the equipment, will you install it? Will you house the data? And I'm not going to turn people away when they ask for that. So things like Valley Forge National Historic Park is going to pay to have us put in 2 sites on part of the regional trail network in their park. Then we're looking at 10 sites in the city of Philadelphia. And then we also have 10 currently that the Center City District, which is a self-taxation improvement district in the Central Core, have installed that we store the data for them on. And then we're looking at approximately 10 sites in the suburban counties. And these would be sidewalks, non-trail sites. The cyclical counting program, we basically, I explained, it's sites that are counted on a cyclical basis, generally a 3-year rotation. We are just now completing the initial blast where we went out and we collected 1 week of data at 150 sites. And then that data is used as baseline. And then from here on out, every year we'll count approximately 50 locations. And that data is used to track the trends either in mode share or at a specific site. Then the project counts are sites that are counted for a specific project or purpose. The week-long data is collected with raw data adjusted to annual average daily pedestrians based on the seasonal factors provided by the permanent sites, and that data is used to establish facility use. Now, if you want to, some examples of project counts, many of you are familiar with the Tiger Grant program. And that requires before counts, which many times if it's a new facility are 0, but 3 years of after counts. Also, we've done counts for the City of Philadelphia, Department of Health, part of their Get Fit Philly program. And even First Friday pedestrian counts in Old City. Excuse me. And to date, we've conducted over 1,000 of these short duration counts, which are 1 week long. On the permanent count program, we cited for the trail side, the circuit, we cited diversity of trail use, recreation, commuter, and in urban areas, suburban and rural areas, we basically would go out and take a 1 week count at a candidate site and then see if that fit nicely into the layout for our different factor groups, because we didn't want to get 12 sites that were all recreation or 12 that were all commuter. We needed to have a nice spread. The counting equipment, we did look for paved surfaces on the regional trails, and we of course brought in our county governments and other stakeholders, and together with staff they selected 12 locations. And then we worked also with the trail hosts. Once we had the idea of where we wanted it roughly, they would help us to nail down the exact location. On this slide you can see the regional trail network. Eventually when the circuit is complete it will be over 700 miles of trails. The bluish trails are currently complete, green are under construction, and yellow are planned. So you can see we're pretty far along in developing the regional trail network. And the little amber dots are locations where our permanent counters are located. When we are installing these, there are certain things, I'll just summarize the slide, guidelines you have to follow. AASHTO has certain guidelines as far as control devices, and we have other guidelines we have to follow, and then of course you always want to respect local standards. As far as the the pedestrian equipment, you can see on the left-hand side, if you look up that light post, you're going to see a little box up there, and that's basically a control unit for an eco counter permanent installation. And on the right-hand side light, where it connects to the vertical post at a 45-degree angle, you might be able to see the sensor. This, by placing it that high, you're actually you're lessening the problems presented by occlusion. Now on the short duration, we also use eco counter equipment. This is an installation on the Walnut Street Bridge. And you'll notice one of the interesting things here is the directive from eco counter is that these counters be set approximately hip height. Now the reason why you want it at the hip is if you set it any lower, each leg of a passing person would be counted as a pedestrian, which would lead to double counting. That raises an interesting problem though, and I kept hearing, well, we have this occlusion factor, but it's not really an occlusion factor, it's I call it a technology factor. And the reason why is when you have it set at hip height, if you have babies in coaches, they're defined by the law as a pedestrian, but you're not picking them up. So they're not really occluded, they're just not included. And then, of course, on the trails, you can see the post there. Shawn had a very nice picture showing the inductive loops for measuring bicycles, and then the post with the infrared sensor buried in the post. And this was an installation on the Kenwood Heritage Trail. Now, it was mentioned several times, you have a very important job to do, and that's called equipment validation. Once you're out there, you want to test your equipment with manual backup so that you have an idea of what your undercount is. And here this is the results of the validation exercise for the first year. We haven't needed the columns as pretty since then, of our pedestrian equipment. And you'll notice there were 5 locations, 10 hours at each location. So a total of 50 hours, approximately 25,000 pedestrians counted, and we had an undercount of 6.22%. And that technology became the technology factor applied to the counts. Below each location, you will notice it's not clear here because it's reduced so much, but it gives the weather for the day, the high temperature, low temperature, the facing material, whether it was glass, masonry, brick, etc., and then some description about the location. And that middle location, you'll notice, is Jefferson Hospital's daycare facility. So this is why I bring up the babies and coaches, because that was very definitely a factor at that location. Oops. There we go. Now, it's great to have all this data, but if you can't get the data out to the people who are interested in seeing it, you're not doing anybody any favors. And so we have a very talented GIS department here at DVRPC and database people. And so they developed web viewers. The first web viewer was for the approximately 90,000 traffic counts we have. We still do about 5,000 traffic counts a year. And then we have this second web viewer, which is the bicycle and pedestrian web viewer. And this is a great I like it a lot better than the traffic viewer because you click on a location here and this window pops up. It shows you one count. You'll see there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There have been 6 counts at that location. You can toggle between them, see the count, see the totals, and you'll see the weather. And there you have prevailing conditions, high temperature, low temperature for each day of your 7-day count. There's also above that Google Street View of the location. And then you see the little blue box that says View the Report. And you can actually click on View the Report and see the report of the hourly volumes at that location. Again, repeating the weather information, giving you the information up top, which is all of the background, facility from to, the from limit to limit, county, MCD, the actual DVRPC file number, the counter it was used, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the hourly totals, some at the bottom. Then from the completed days, those are have the seasonal adjustment factor and the technology factor applied to them, yielding you an AADP, annual average daily pedestrians. So that pretty much summarizes our program. One thing that I haven't heard, and I want to caution everyone too, and that is, in having been doing this now for 7 years and producing over 2,000 short duration counts, both on the bicycle and pedestrian side, when you see an aberration in your data, don't automatically assume that you have equipment failure. And I can give you several examples. I'll just give you one real quick. On the bicycle side, we did a permanent installation up on the Lawrence Hopewell Trail, and after the first month we were reviewing the data, and about midnight one night we had this sudden spike in bicycles, and anybody would automatically say, well, you've got equipment failure, something's going wrong here. But don't be so quick to write off the what you're seeing. When we investigated, it turns out that that part of the trail passes by Educational Testing Services headquarters and several other corporate headquarters around there, and they sponsor a moonlight bike ride once a month, and you are seeing the results of that. So just always look into it before you quickly ignore the data.
Great. That's great advice, Scott, and it's great to hear that the Delaware Valley is a leader in traffic monitoring programs. And so we know that Scott is doing great things in his region, but what about you? We know that there are folks tuning in that have recommendations for others who are starting programs. So we're going to take this opportunity for you to enter into your chat pane or in the Google document, what recommendations would you give others that are just starting a pedestrian traffic monitoring program? And you can view some of the responses that have already come in online up on the screen. We'll just give you a couple of minutes to do this since we're running a few minutes behind. And after you share this information, we'll get into the general Q&A session. So some of the recommendations that have come in from folks from around the country. So Christian from Morgantown, West Virginia suggests that use your data in combination with intercept surveys to quantify the health and economic impacts of trails. And that will help to build greater support for the work that you're doing relating to pedestrian improvements. And then also we see a response from Greensboro, North Carolina. So research locations where you're going to conduct the count. So for example, high crash locations, high use, downtown, upcoming improvement projects, as well as research methods and technologies based on your budget, locations, and purposes. Some really good recommendations. So Scott, any thoughts on to the recommendations that you're seeing come in?
I was reading them through as you were going over them, and actually I think they're very good recommendations. There are a few things that I saw in here that I had not thought of,
okay,
or given serious consideration to, that I'm now going to think I'm going to take a second look at them. So I
Okay.
definitely find that there are some very useful recommendations here.
Okay. Great. And so now we're going to open up the Q&A to all of our speakers. So if you feel like you have an answer to some of the general questions that folks are posing, please feel free to chime in. The first one I'm just going to direct at Krista first, and perhaps others may have more things to add. But this comment is from Stephen Jesberger with FHWA. So his comment is, many people don't know what the FHWA travel monitoring analysis system may be. And it would be good for perhaps Krista to explain why, explain this so that people know what you guys are doing as far as developing a way to receive all non-motorized data in TMG format. I know that's a lot of acronyms and things to pose to the audience, but as you recall from the initial poll, about 67% of those tuning in are not familiar with the TMG. So.
Great, wonderful. I appreciate Stephen's reminding me that I need to explain that. So right now, FHWA houses an archive for all the motor vehicle count data that is fed from the states to FHWA, and then that informs the HPMS system, sorry, another acronym, but all of that informs Congress. This is where we get our vehicle miles traveled estimates. This is where our official numbers come from. So it's a very important data set, and usually that data flow from the states to the federal government. There's a quality checking process. This is all described in the traffic monitoring guide and how it should be done, and exactly the format, as I mentioned, that it should be coming into the TMAS, or Travel Monitoring Analysis System. And that informs policy at the national level, and in fact is part of how money is divvied up to the state DOTs. So this is a very important data set. At this time, if I'm understanding correctly from what I've learned from FHWA, it's not including bike and ped data yet, but it will very soon, and they are working hard on making that happen. So we have the format that we can start using, and that is a very important part of the work we're doing as part of this project. So it's the format, if you've looked at it, isn't something that is easily grasped by a fourth grader, but it's something that you can format your data in, and we can also provide some help on how to do that. And it's something that the states are used to doing, so that's how the data flow. And Stephen, if you want me to say additional things, please just let us know, because Stephen Jesberger is the expert on that, and I appreciate his comments.
Oh, great. Okay, great. So we're just going to jump into some of these more detailed questions. So when validating the equipment's accuracy and precision, how many hours of data collected manually is needed to compare? So, for example, to determine if it is consistently under or over counting. Shawn, any other speakers?
I'll take a stab at it, and Shawn can add on to it.
Okay.
Yeah. If you have several days of count data, obviously there's going to be a statistical test that says whether or not you're getting consistent results. It's a fairly simple statistical test that can be done in Excel. Probably the easiest is probably the CHI test, which is simply a comparison of two distributions to see whether or not they come from the same source population. That sounds a little geeky, statistically, but that's what it is, and it's very, very simple to do in Excel. But it basically compares the counts from one day, the counts from another day, or the counts from 1 week, or the counts from another week, or the counts by day of week or hour of day to another set and says, did these come from the same population, or what's the probability they did? Or more frequently, the test is, did they not? So are they statistically significantly different is often a better question to ask in these terms than are they the same. But it's fairly simple to do. It can be done in Excel, and if somebody wants to see how that's done, I can shoot them an example of what we programmed for some other comparative analysis out of Excel. Shawn, do you want to add to that?
So I guess could you repeat the question, Hal? Because I interpreted that to mean they were asking how long to do the validation counts, not what statistical test. Is that correct?
How many hours of data collected manually is needed to compare?
Yeah, so that can vary. It really varies depending upon when you're out there. So I would look to a couple of hours during some of the more challenging times. For example, when there's more people out there, when there's occlusion. I'm going to ask Scott how many hours. I know he showed a validation slide. We typically use a couple of hours, and in some cases you can tell right away if a sensor is not positioned properly just by seeing a couple people pass and either double activating or not activating. On a more systematic basis, though, Scott, what's your experience? It sounds like you've done quite a bit of that.
You're absolutely right, Shawn. Whenever you set any counter, and that includes on the motorized side too, when you're setting pneumatic tubes, your field person should always stay there for 5 or so minutes and watch and make sure that targets are being registered. The initial one that I showed on that one slide was really overkill, but it was the first time that we had dealt with the technology, and I wanted to make sure we were very thorough. It's not necessary to do 50 hours and 25,000 pedestrians. A few hours is more than sufficient. But one thing that people do forget to point out is validation of equipment, and this goes for vehicle, this goes for weigh in motion equipment, should be an annual exercise. That's something that should be done every year for even a short term, just to start seeing when you're sliding out of calibration. Because I know we have the first generation of pyroelectric sensors that we had, which were 2009, are now in for rehabilitation at EcoCounter because we were getting some really weird data, and so we basically sent it, after doing a check on it, we actually sent a whole batch of them back to EcoCounter and are paying to have them rehabbed.
Yeah, and I would say even probably, so you can get some equipment drift. An important caution that I would add is manufacturer's recommendations. Read the instruction manual. It's going to vary from equipment type to equipment type. Typically, the manufacturers have a certain way that they've tested it. You want to try and follow that as closely as possible. And so to me, that would be, even before you validate, you want to read the manual and make sure you're installing it according to the manufacturer's instructions.
Absolutely.
Great, thanks. So unfortunately, we are over our time, but what we'll do is we'll continue to answer questions for the next 5 minutes, and any questions that have remained unanswered, we will work with our speakers to get responses to, and we'll send out those responses to the audience members, because we do want to try to get some of those questions answered. So I'll take about 2 or 3 more questions, and the speakers will try to respond to them as quickly and as expediently as possible. So the next one is, what kinds of QA/QC checks can be performed on SDC data, and are there example processes to share?
That was an acronym that I wasn't familiar with. SB, what was the SBC?
SDC? Have we stumped our experts?
So
I'm guessing that's short duration count.
Yeah.
I think that's short duration count, maybe.
Okay.
So I always, my rule of thumb is just make sure you count at least 10 people correctly. If you can check the count, if the counter allows you to check, yes, this person was counted, yes, that person was counted. That's a minimum check that I like to do.
Okay. Great. Anyone else? Any thoughts on QA, QC checks for short duration count data?
That's a really challenging area. I mean, so I guess my response is just use reality checks and a little bit of observation at that site may go a long way as to what you might expect versus what you're seeing in your count data. But again, if you've only got a few hours, a few days, it's really hard to develop any kind of expectation of what is normal, particularly if the counts are somewhat low and variable day to day.
Another important thing is to see if it's overcounting, if you're getting any phantom pedestrians walking by, because that would totally mess up your count. If you're actually counting nearby vehicles or you're counting vegetation that's moving with your infrared counter, that can totally make your data set unuseful. So looking out for those type of things when you do the first install, even if it's a short duration count, is really important.
Okay, great, great. And so this next question relates to Scott and the GIS tools that you have developed for Delaware, the Delaware Valley. So are the bike ped data web viewer based on spreadsheets imported into Google Maps and Earth? For example, is it easily shared or used by other communities as long as their data are in the format used by Philly?
They're not in spreadsheets.
Okay.
All of our count data, motorized and non-motorized, is housed in an Oracle database. And although it's got a Microsoft front end, just because Oracle is really hard on the eyes. But so when we read it in actually from the EcoCounter software or from other JMAR software, it's read into an Oracle database, and we have a brilliant database person here who writes the scripts and actually organizes all of that. And all of it is open code. We've offered this across the country, and several MPOs have taken us up on it, where we will actually just lock, stock, and barrel pick up the entire platform and give it to them. So other than that, I don't know what else to say. I mean, the GIS function is one of simple latitude, longitude, although we do, where we have, say, a Sharrow or a bike lane, we do use the SR segment offset or SRI milepost of the roadways linear referencing system. And you'll find that a lot of the equipment that has premiered this year, one of the new functions is that it includes a GPS attachment. It's built into the equipment, and it actually embeds in the data the GPS coordinates of where the data was gathered. So it stops funny business from happening with consultants and such.
Great, great. Thanks, Scott. So this is a question for all of the speakers today. So has any work been done on leveraging permanent counts from other areas for communities that don't have permanent counts? So for example, permanent count data from a similar weather, typography, population, facility to help establish factors for facility in a community that has fewer resources for a counting program. Has anybody heard of that being done?
There have been a number of papers submitted to TRB on the transferability of seasonal correction factors, and the papers I'm thinking of are all dealing with bicycles. One of them was Vancouver and Edmonton were paired and such, and the results from the papers were that the bike culture in each city is so unique that its reaction to weather conditions is different from the bike culture in any other city, and unfortunately it made it impossible to transfer the seasonal correction factors from one urban area to another. Shawn, did you see anything in stuff that you've read?
I've heard of anecdotes, but I guess I can't point to any particular place.
So there is a project ongoing by Rails to Trails to look at trails across the U.S. and create factors based on different climate regions. I'm nervous about that for the reasons Scott just mentioned, that I'm not sure how well those will apply to a region, of the U.S. is quite diverse, and I think we should be cautious about applying those. I think in general we want to look at counters in the region, as in like the metropolitan region, for our seasonal adjustment factors, instead of looking for counters in a neighboring state, because those are likely to have a very different pattern. And there's also the National Bike Ped Documentation Project has some adjustment factors, and I think those are great if you're writing a proposal and you just need some numbers and to show that you're understanding this process, but really they can't replace the information you would get from a permanent count station in your region, which experiences your particular microclimate.
And more than that, more than just the count stations in your region, I concur with everything everybody else has said, that it really gets down to, even within your region, the type of facility in your region. As we heard pointed out, you had one location that had counts late at night specifically because of where they were. I've heard of another location in Colorado where they had the exact same thing because that's when the bars closed. So the specific type of facility and patterns along that facility, we've really got to have a sharp pencil with these, I think.
Great, thanks for all your comments. Unfortunately, we have gone over our time by about 10 minutes, and certainly we have enough material to talk about this for another hour, but we know that you all have jobs to get back to, and so unfortunately we are out of time. Just want to thank all of our speakers again for spending time with us and sharing their knowledge and experience with pedestrian monitoring programs, and this concludes our webinar. So for the questions that have remained unanswered, we will work with our speakers to respond to them and send the responses out to folks who signed up for the webinar. And if you have individual questions, you can see their contact information for the speakers up on our screen as well, and you can contact any of those folks directly. So thank you again for joining us today, and thanks again for all of our speakers. Have a nice day.